The Instagram post appeared on my feed at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had already been testing my emotional resilience, the image loading slowly over my phone's weak data connection until I could see it clearly enough to feel my heart stop beating. There was my family, my parents Robert and Linda Chen, my brother Michael, his wife Jessica, and their 2 young children, all beaming at the camera from what appeared to be the deck of a luxury resort, overlooking turquoise waters that could only belong to some expensive tropical paradise. Family vacation in paradise. Nothing beats quality time with the people you love most. Blessed, notre family time, notre Caribbean vibes, read the caption beneath the photo, posted by my sister-in-law Jessica, who had apparently taken on the role of family social media coordinator since marrying into the Chen clan 3 years ago. I stared at the screen until my eyes began to water, not from the brightness, but from the crushing realization that my entire family had gone on what looked like a week-long Caribbean vacation without mentioning it to me, without inviting me, without even acknowledging my existence enough to explain why I had been excluded from this gathering of the people you love most. The timing made the betrayal even more devastating. Exactly 18 days earlier, I had withdrawn $3,000 from my savings account, money I had been accumulating for months by working double shifts as a medical technician and eating ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week, and given it to my parents when they called me crying about their financial emergency. "Sarah, sweetheart, we don't know what else to do," my mother had sobbed over the phone, her voice thick with what I had interpreted as genuine desperation. "Your father's medication costs have gone up again, and we're behind on the mortgage. We can't afford groceries this month, and I'm so embarrassed to even ask, but we're at the end of our rope." Dad had gotten on the phone next, his voice carrying the defeated tone of a man whose pride had been stripped away by circumstances beyond his control. "We wouldn't ask if we had any other options, honey. We know you work hard for your money, and we know you have your own bills to pay. But if you could help us just this once, we promise we'll pay you back as soon as things stabilize." I had driven to their house that same evening with a cashier's check for $3,000, nearly wiping out my emergency fund, but unable to ignore the image of my parents struggling to afford basic necessities like food and medication. They had hugged me with tears in their eyes, thanking me repeatedly for being such a responsible, caring daughter who was willing to sacrifice for family when times were tough. "You're saving us, Sarah," Mom had whispered, as she held the check like it was a winning lottery ticket. "We don't know what we would have done without you." 18 days later, they were posting photos from a Caribbean resort that probably cost more per night than I made in a week, while I was eating another dinner of instant noodles and trying to figure out how to stretch my remaining $400 until my next paycheck. I scrolled through more photos from their trip: expensive meals, snorkeling excursions, spa treatments, shopping trips to boutiques that sold jewelry I could never afford. In every image, my family looked relaxed, happy, and completely unburdened by the financial struggles that had supposedly required my emergency assistance. But what hurt more than the financial deception was the casual way I had been erased from their family narrative. These weren't photos of a vacation that had been planned before their emergency. The timestamps showed they had been posted over the past 5 days, meaning they had taken my money and immediately used it to fund a luxury trip, while deliberately excluding me from both the planning and the experience. I called my brother Michael, the family's golden child who had never been asked to sacrifice anything for anyone, but had somehow been included in this expensive family bonding experience. "Hey Sarah, what's up?" he answered, his voice carrying the relaxed tone of someone who was clearly still on vacation. "I see you're all in the Caribbean," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the rage building in my chest. "Yeah, it's amazing here. Dad found this great last-minute deal, and we decided to take a family trip. The kids are loving the beach." "Last-minute deal," I repeated. "When did you decide to take this trip?" "About 3 weeks ago, I think. Jessica had some vacation time she needed to use, and Mom and Dad said they really needed a break from all their stress. 3 weeks ago. They had been planning this expensive vacation at the exact same time they were begging me for money to buy groceries and pay for medication. They had looked me in the eye, accepted my life savings, and then immediately boarded a plane to paradise without even considering whether I might want to join them. "Why wasn't I invited?" I asked, the question coming out smaller and more vulnerable than I had intended. Michael was quiet for a moment, probably realizing for the first time that his sister hadn't simply chosen not to join the family vacation. "Oh, Sarah, I just assumed you couldn't afford it. You know how expensive these trips can be, and with your job situation, my job situation," as if being a medical technician was somehow less legitimate than Michael's marketing career that had been handed to him through family connections and unearned advantages. "Michael," I gave Mom and Dad $3,000 18 days ago because they said they couldn't afford food and medicine. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how much my family had been lying to me and how little they valued my sacrifices on their behalf. The phone call from my parents had come at 11:23 p.m. on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks earlier, jarring me awake from the exhausted sleep that came after pulling a 12-hour shift at Riverside Medical Center. I had been working doubles twice a week for 4 months, trying to build up my savings account enough to finally move out of my studio apartment and into a place with an actual bedroom, maybe even enough space for a small table where I could eat meals sitting down instead of standing over the kitchen counter. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to wake you." Mom's voice was thick with tears that sounded genuine through the phone speaker, but we didn't know who else to call. I sat up in bed, instantly alert the way medical professionals learn to be when crisis calls come at inconvenient hours. "What's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "It's not medical." Dad's voice came on the line, suggesting they had me on speakerphone. "It's financial. We're in serious trouble, honey, and we don't know what else to do." They explained their situation with the kind of desperate detail that people provide when they're trying to convince someone to help them with money. Dad's diabetes medication costs had increased dramatically when their insurance changed formularies. Mom's part-time job at the boutique had cut her hours due to slow business. They were behind on their mortgage payments, their credit cards were maxed out, and they had been choosing between groceries and prescription medications for the past 2 weeks. "We've never been in a situation like this," Mom sobbed. "We've always been able to manage our finances, but everything hit at once, and we just can't keep up." I knew my parents weren't wealthy, but I had never imagined they were struggling to afford basic necessities. They lived in the same middle-class house where I had grown up, drove cars that were several years old but reliable, and maintained the kind of comfortable lifestyle that had always made me assume they were financially stable if not prosperous. "How much do you need?" I asked, already mentally calculating how much I could afford to give them without completely emptying my savings account. "We hate to ask," Dad said, "but if we could borrow $3,000, it would cover the mortgage payment and give us enough for groceries and medication until things stabilize." $3,000. Nearly everything I had managed to save over 6 months of working extra shifts and denying myself anything beyond absolute necessities. Money I had been planning to use for a security deposit on a better apartment, for a reliable car to replace my aging Honda, for the kind of financial cushion that would let me sleep better at night. But they were my parents, and the idea of them choosing between food and medication, while I had money sitting in a savings account, felt morally unacceptable. Family was supposed to help family, especially when the need was genuine, and the consequences of not helping were serious. "I can give you $3,000, I said, the words coming out before I had time to fully consider the implications. "But I'll need to get a cashier's check tomorrow since it's such a large amount." The relief in their voices was overwhelming. Mom started crying again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than desperation. Dad kept thanking me and promising they would pay me back as soon as their situation improved, maybe within a few months when Mom's hours increased and they could get their budget back on track. "You're saving us, Sarah," Mom said through her tears. "We raised such a good daughter. We're so proud of you for being willing to help family when we need it most." I went to the bank the next morning before my shift, withdrawing $3,000 from my savings account and watching my balance drop to $437.82, barely enough to cover my rent and utilities for the next month, leaving nothing for groceries, gas, or any emergency that might arise in my own life. The drive to my parents' house felt like a pilgrimage of sacrifice, carrying money I couldn't really afford to give to people who had raised me and deserved my help in their time of need. I imagined Dad being able to afford his medication without rationing doses, Mom being able to buy groceries without checking prices on every item, both of them sleeping better at night, knowing their mortgage was current. When I handed them the cashier's check, they hugged me like I had just saved their lives. Mom held the check with shaking hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she thanked me repeatedly for being such a loving, responsible daughter. "We'll never forget this," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "Someday when you need help, we'll be there for you the same way you're here for us now. Someday when I needed help, I had never imagined that someday would come so soon, or that it would reveal truths about my family that would shatter everything I thought I understood about love, sacrifice, and the reciprocal nature of family obligations." The check cleared my account on Friday morning. By the following Tuesday, my parents were posting photos from a Caribbean vacation that cost at least twice what I had given them, while I was calculating whether I could afford to buy fresh vegetables or if I needed to stick with rice and beans for another week. The sacrifice I had made wasn't just financial. It was emotional, representing my belief that family meant something, that love required action, and that my parents valued my contributions enough to be honest about their needs and grateful for my help. Instead, I had learned that my family saw me as a convenient source of funding for their lifestyle choices, someone whose sacrifices could be casually exploited without consideration or reciprocation. Growing up as the second Chen child meant learning early that love was a finite resource in our household, carefully rationed and primarily allocated to Michael, who had claimed the majority share simply by being born first and male, in a family that valued traditional hierarchies more than individual merit. From my earliest memories, I understood that my role was to be grateful for whatever attention remained after Michael's needs, achievements, and interests had been fully addressed. The pattern established itself when I was still young enough to believe that parental favoritism was somehow related to actual worthiness, rather than arbitrary preference. Michael's kindergarten artwork was displayed prominently on the refrigerator and discussed with visiting relatives as evidence of his artistic talent. My drawings were acknowledged with brief praise before being relegated to a drawer where forgotten childhood creations went to die. "Michael is so creative," Mom would tell her friends, showing off his stick figure drawings as if they were masterpieces worthy of museum display. "He has such a special way of seeing the world." My own artwork, which teachers consistently praised as advanced for my age, was dismissed as nice or pretty, but never discussed as evidence of any special talent or potential that might deserve nurturing or investment. School performances followed the same pattern. Michael's role as a tree in the second-grade play required costume planning, multiple rehearsal attendance, and professional photography to capture his starring moment. My lead role in the fifth-grade musical was acknowledged with brief attendance and a few snapshots taken with Mom's phone between checking her messages. "Michael looks so handsome up there," Dad whispered during my performance, apparently forgetting that his daughter was the one actually singing and dancing on stage, while his son stood motionless in brown construction paper. Academic achievements created the most painful disparities. Michael's B+ report cards were celebrated with dinner at his favorite restaurant and praise for his improvement and effort. My straight A's were expected, acknowledged with nods of approval, and immediately followed by suggestions about areas where I might challenge myself more. "Sarah is naturally academic," Mom would explain to relatives who commented on the disparity in celebration. "She doesn't need as much encouragement as Michael. Some children are just more self-motivated." Self-motivated became the code word for requiring less investment. While Michael received tutoring, enrichment programs, and expensive educational resources to help him achieve mediocrity, I was expected to excel independently and be grateful for basic school supplies. The financial inequality was stark, but never acknowledged directly. Michael's birthday parties were elaborate affairs with themes, decorations, and guest lists that required weeks of planning and significant expense. My birthdays were celebrated with cake at home and gifts that were practical rather than exciting, school clothes instead of toys, books instead of the electronics I actually wanted. "We're teaching you the value of money," Dad explained when I asked why Michael got a new bicycle while I received a backpack for my birthday. "Girls need to understand financial responsibility earlier than boys." Financial responsibility at age 10 apparently meant accepting that my desires were less important than my brother's, that my happiness was worth less investment, and that gratitude for basics was more important than receiving things that might bring joy. High school guidance counseling revealed the full extent of my parents' differential expectations. Michael's mediocre grades and complete lack of direction were treated as temporary setbacks that required professional intervention and family support. College prep courses, SAT tutoring, and application assistance were provided without question, despite his obvious lack of academic motivation. "Michael is a late bloomer," the college counselor told me during my appointment, apparently briefed by my parents about family dynamics. "Your parents are investing heavily in helping him find his path. You, on the other hand, seem to have everything figured out already." Everything figured out at 17 meant being expected to navigate college applications, scholarship searches, and career planning independently, while watching my parents spend thousands of dollars trying to manufacture success for my brother, who couldn't be bothered to complete his homework consistently. I earned a partial scholarship to the state university based on academic merit, and worked part-time throughout college to cover expenses that my parents claimed they couldn't afford to help with after funding Michael's education at a private school that specialized in helping underachieving students develop their potential. "Sarah is more practical," Mom explained to relatives who questioned why their daughter was working her way through school while their son's education was fully funded. "She doesn't need the same kind of support structure that Michael requires. Practical, independent, self-motivated, The words that had defined my childhood and adolescence, all meaning the same thing. Sarah can take care of herself, so we don't need to take care of Sarah. After college, the pattern continued in new forms. Michael's job search was a family project involving network connections, resume assistance, and emotional support through multiple rejections. My career development was my own responsibility, approached with the understanding that I should be grateful for whatever opportunities I could create for myself. Michael is sensitive about professional setbacks, Dad explained when I asked why they didn't offer me the same level of career guidance they provided my brother. You've always been more resilient. Resilient, another code word for requiring less love and support. By the time I was working as a medical technician and living in a studio apartment while Michael enjoyed a marketing career facilitated by family connections, I had learned to expect nothing from my parents except the opportunity to provide support when they needed it. The $3,000 I gave them represented the first time they had ever asked me for help, and I had been foolish enough to believe it meant I was finally valued as a contributing family member, rather than just a convenient resource to be exploited when circumstances required additional funding for their preferred lifestyle. I drove to my parents' house the morning after discovering their Caribbean vacation photos, my hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to leave marks on my palms as I rehearsed the confrontation that had been building in my mind since seeing their luxury resort images. The 20-minute drive gave me time to cycle through anger, hurt, and disbelief, but by the time I pulled into their driveway, I had settled into a cold fury that felt more sustainable than the raw emotional pain that had kept me awake all night. Their house looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks earlier when I had delivered the cashier's check. The same well-maintained suburban exterior that projected middle-class stability. The same manicured lawn that suggested people who had time and money for aesthetic concerns. The same BMW and Lexus in the driveway that I had somehow never questioned, despite their claims of financial hardship. Mom answered the door wearing a sundress and sandals that looked new, her skin carrying the kind of golden tan that only comes from recent tropical sun exposure. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, probably expecting a routine family visit rather than a confrontation about lies and betrayal. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt performative rather than genuine. Come in. Your father will be so happy to see you." Dad was in the living room, looking relaxed and refreshed in ways that contradicted his recent claims of stress and desperation. He was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee from a mug that had "Paradise Found" printed on it with a cartoon palm tree, apparently a souvenir from their trip. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said, standing to give me his usual perfunctory hug. "What brings you by this morning?" "I saw Jessica's Instagram posts," I said without preamble, deciding that directness would be more effective than building up to the confrontation gradually. "I saw the photos from your Caribbean vacation." The change in atmosphere was immediate. Mom's smile faltered slightly, and Dad's relaxed posture shifted into something more defensive. But neither of them looked particularly surprised or concerned, suggesting they had known this conversation was inevitable and had already prepared their justifications. "Oh, that," Mom said with a dismissive wave. "We should have mentioned it, but everything happened so quickly. You know how last-minute travel deals work." "Last-minute travel deals," I repeated. 3 weeks after I gave you $3,000 because you couldn't afford food and medication." Dad cleared his throat and adopted the patient tone he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable. "Sarah, we appreciate your help during our financial emergency, but that doesn't mean we have to run every decision by you or ask permission to spend our own money." "Your own money?" The question came out sharper than I had intended. "Or my money that you told me was for groceries and prescriptions." "We used your money exactly as we told you we would," Mom said firmly. "We paid our bills and took care of our immediate needs. What we did after that is our business." The gaslighting was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost doubted my own perceptions. But the evidence was undeniable. They had taken my emergency assistance and immediately used it to fund a luxury vacation while claiming they were too poor to afford basic necessities. "So you lied to me about being desperate," I said. "You manipulated me into giving you money by pretending you couldn't afford food and medicine, then used that money to go on vacation." "We didn't lie about anything," Dad replied, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he expected to end discussions through assertion rather than explanation. "We had legitimate financial concerns, and your assistance helped us address those concerns. What we chose to do afterward was independent of your contribution." "You went to the Caribbean," I said, pulling out my phone to show them Jessica's photos. "You stayed at a resort that probably costs more per night than I make in a week. You took a family vacation without inviting me, using money I gave you for emergencies." Mom laughed, actually laughed, at my obvious distress, the sound carrying a mixture of amusement and condescension that made my chest burn with humiliation. "Sarah, sweetheart, you're being dramatic," she said, her tone suggesting I was an emotional child having a tantrum, rather than an adult pointing out obvious betrayal. "We didn't exclude you from the vacation. We just assumed you couldn't afford it." "You assumed I couldn't afford it because I had just given you my life savings," I said. "That's exactly why we didn't invite you," Dad added, as if this explanation made their behavior reasonable rather than cruel. "We knew money was tight for you, and we didn't want to put you in the awkward position of having to decline due to financial constraints." They were rewriting history in real time, transforming their deception into consideration, their exclusion into kindness, their exploitation into family harmony. The casual confidence with which they dismissed my pain and justified their betrayal was more devastating than the original lies. "Besides," Mom continued, "it was really more of a family trip. Michael and Jessica needed quality time with the children, and we wanted to help them create memories. Family trip. As if I weren't family. As if my relationship to them was somehow less legitimate than Michael's. As if my exclusion was natural rather than deliberately hurtful. "I'm your family too," I said quietly. "Of course you are," Dad replied impatiently. "But you have to understand that different family members have different needs and different circumstances. Michael has children now. His priorities have changed. Different circumstances, like being the child who gave money instead of receiving it, who worked double shifts instead of enjoying leisure time, who sacrificed her savings instead of benefiting from other people's sacrifices." They were both laughing again, dismissing my pain as oversensitivity and my accusations as unreasonable expectations. But their laughter died away when I told them what I had already done with their names, their credit, and their carefully constructed financial reputation. Living in the Chen family meant participating in an elaborate performance where appearances mattered more than reality, where maintaining the image of successful, loving parents was more important than actually being successful or loving. For 30 years, I had watched my parents craft a public persona that bore little resemblance to their private behavior, and I had been complicit in that deception by staying silent about the favoritism, neglect, and casual cruelty that defined our actual family dynamics. The performance began with their house, a carefully staged suburban showpiece that projected middle-class prosperity through strategic decorating choices and meticulous maintenance. The living room featured professional family portraits, where we all smiled with practiced warmth, our poses suggesting the kind of close relationships that made other families envious. Visitors never saw the basement office where Dad spent most evenings avoiding family interaction, or the master bedroom where Mom watched television alone while complaining about her ungrateful children. "The Chens are such a close family," neighbors would comment, observing our annual Christmas card photos and 4th of July barbecues where we performed togetherness with Academy Award-worthy conviction. "Their children are so respectful and accomplished." Respectful meant silent about problems. Accomplished meant achieving things that reflected well on our parents' parenting skills. My medical degree and Michael's marketing career were discussed as evidence of excellent family values rather than individual effort, and any struggles we experienced were carefully omitted from public narratives. Social media had given my parents new platforms for their performance art. Mom's Facebook page was filled with proud mother posts about her children's achievements, carefully curated to suggest that both Michael and I received equal support and celebration. Photos from family gatherings were selected to show happiness and unity, while images that might reveal tension or favoritism were deleted before posting. "So blessed to have such wonderful children," Mom would write beneath photos of birthday celebrations and holiday dinners, accumulating likes and comments from friends who believed they were witnessing genuine family love rather than choreographed presentations. Church provided another venue for their carefully maintained image. They attended services regularly, volunteered for community projects, and participated in social events where their generosity and family values were publicly displayed and admired. I had accompanied them to countless church functions where they accepted praise for raising such responsible, well-adjusted children. "Robert and Linda have done such a beautiful job with Sarah and Michael," church friends would say, never knowing that Robert and Linda's parenting consisted primarily of investing in Michael while expecting me to be grateful for basic acknowledgement of my existence. The financial facade was perhaps the most elaborate aspect of their performance. They lived in a house that suggested comfort without ostentation, drove cars that were reliable, but not flashy, and maintained lifestyles that appeared sustainable on Dad's accounting firm's salary and Mom's part-time retail income. Nobody questioned how they afforded private school for Michael, family vacations, or the kind of discretionary spending that characterized their actual lifestyle. "We're very careful with money," Mom would tell friends who asked about their financial management. We live within our means and save for the things that matter most to our family. Living within their means, I now realized, included periodic financial infusions from the daughter they had taught to value family obligation over personal financial security. The $3,000 I had given them wasn't the first time they had asked for help. It was just the largest amount, and the first time I had been naive enough to believe their emergency was genuine, rather than manufactured. Looking back through years of family interactions, I could identify a pattern of financial manipulation disguised as temporary hardship, small loans that were never repaid, emergency assistance that coincided with luxury purchases, crisis requests that always seemed to precede family activities I wasn't invited to participate in. "Sarah is so generous with family," Mom would say when relatives noticed my contributions to various family expenses. "She understands the importance of supporting people you love." Generous with family. Understanding the importance of support. Code words for being successfully manipulated into funding other people's lifestyle choices, while maintaining the illusion that giving money to relatives was voluntary rather than expected. The most insidious aspect of their facade was how they had convinced me to participate in my own exploitation. They had trained me from childhood to believe that my worth was measured by my usefulness to others, that love required sacrifice without reciprocation, and that family meant giving without expecting anything in return. "We're so proud of Sarah," Dad would tell people who asked about his children. "She's always been the responsible one, the one who takes care of others without being asked." Responsible, taking care of others. Phrases that sounded like praise, but actually described someone who had been programmed to accept less while giving more, someone whose boundaries had been systematically eroded until exploitation felt like love and sacrifice felt like obligation. The Caribbean vacation photos represented the moment when their facade finally cracked, when the gap between their public image and private behavior became too obvious to ignore or explain away. They had been careless, posting evidence of luxury while claiming poverty, celebrating family togetherness while excluding the family member who had funded their celebration. But their biggest mistake was assuming I would continue to participate in the performance, that I would accept their lies and manipulation with the same grateful silence that had characterized my role in their family dynamic for 30 years. Instead, I had decided to use their own tactics against them, to create facades and maintain appearances while systematically destroying the financial foundation that supported their carefully constructed lifestyle. They had taught me that reality mattered less than perception, that maintaining an image was more important than being honest. Now they were about to learn how quickly facades could crumble when someone with comprehensive knowledge of their personal information decided to stop supporting their performance and start creating consequences for their behavior. The Chens were about to discover that their daughter had learned their lessons about deception and manipulation better than they had ever intended to teach them. The drive home from my parents' house took place in a haze of rage so pure and consuming that I barely remembered navigating traffic or stopping at red lights. Their laughter echoed in my head, not the warm family laughter that I had craved throughout my childhood, but the cold, dismissive sound of people who found genuine pain amusing and justified their cruelty through casual condescension. "You're being dramatic, Sarah." The words replayed on a loop as I climbed the stairs to my studio apartment, each repetition making me angrier and more determined to prove that being dramatic wasn't the same as being wrong. They had stolen my money, lied about their circumstances, excluded me from family activities, and then laughed when I pointed out their betrayal. 30 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and exploited had led to this moment when they felt comfortable mocking my pain because they had never faced consequences for treating me as disposable. I sat on my Murphy bed, surrounded by bills I couldn't afford to pay, looking around at an apartment furnished with secondhand items and discount store finds, trying to reconcile my current circumstances with the luxury resort photos my family had posted while using my money. The contrast was so stark it felt surreal. I was eating ramen noodles for dinner while they enjoyed poolside cocktails. I was calculating whether I could afford laundry detergent while they were shopping for vacation souvenirs. But what hurt more than the financial inequality was the realization that my parents saw me as a resource, rather than a person. They didn't love me. They loved what I could provide for them. My sacrifices weren't appreciated. They were expected. My struggles weren't concerning. They were convenient, because they kept me grateful for scraps of attention and willing to give away money I couldn't afford to lose. The decision crystallized slowly, emerging from the fog of hurt and anger like a mathematical equation that had always been true, but was only now becoming visible. If my parents wanted to treat family relationships as financial transactions, If they wanted to operate through deception and manipulation, if they wanted to laugh at my pain while benefiting from my sacrifices, then I would show them exactly how effective those tactics could be when used by someone who understood their vulnerabilities. I opened my laptop and began researching identity theft protection services, credit monitoring systems, and financial security measures that responsible adults use to protect themselves from exactly the kind of attack I was planning to launch against my parents. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was learning about financial crimes by reading prevention guides, understanding how to destroy credit by studying how to protect it. My parents had made a crucial error in their decades of financial manipulation. They had taught me to be careful with money, thorough in my research, and strategic in my planning. The same skills that made me a reliable employee and a responsible borrower would make me an effective financial predator when I decided to turn those abilities against people who had earned my resentment. I spent hours studying credit reporting systems, loan application processes, and the various ways that someone with access to personal information could damage another person's financial reputation. The research was fascinating in a horrible way. There were so many vulnerabilities in the systems that protected people's economic identities, so many opportunities for someone with knowledge and determination to cause lasting damage. But I didn't want to simply hurt my parents randomly. I wanted to create consequences that matched their behavior, justice that reflected the scope of their betrayal. They had used my financial trust to fund their luxury lifestyle, while excluding me from the benefits. I would use their financial information to create problems that would force them to experience the kind of stress and desperation they had lied about having. The plan began taking shape around midnight, fueled by anger and caffeine, and the kind of methodical problem-solving that I brought to complex medical procedures at work. I would apply for credit cards in their names, take out small loans against their equity, and make financial decisions that would slowly but systematically destroy their credit scores and ability to maintain their current lifestyle. More importantly, I would time everything to coincide with their attempts to maintain the facades that were so important to their self-image. They cared more about appearing successful than being honest. I would make it impossible for them to appear successful regardless of how much they lied about their circumstances. I gathered the personal information I needed from years of family interactions, social security numbers I had memorized from insurance forms, birth dates and addresses that were family knowledge, mothers' maiden names and childhood addresses that had come up in casual conversation. My parents had never bothered to protect their personal information from their daughter, because they had never imagined I might use it against them. The first applications were surprisingly easy to complete. Online lending platforms asked for basic information that I possessed, offered quick approval processes that didn't require extensive verification, and provided credit limits that were large enough to cause serious financial problems without being immediately obvious. I started small, a few $100s here and there, amounts that would appear on their credit reports but might not be noticed immediately. By 3 a.m., I had successfully opened 4 credit accounts in my parents' names and charged approximately $2,000 in purchases that would begin appearing on their statements within the next billing cycle. The transactions were carefully chosen to look like normal spending patterns, gas stations, grocery stores, department stores, rather than obviously fraudulent activity that might trigger immediate investigation. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I would gradually escalate the financial pressure, creating enough debt and credit problems to force them into the kind of genuine financial emergency they had lied about experiencing. They would discover what it actually felt like to be desperate, to choose between necessities, to face consequences for their poor decisions. And when they finally understood what real financial hardship looked like, I would reveal exactly who had created their problems and why they deserved every moment of stress and humiliation they experienced. My parents had laughed at my pain. Soon I would be laughing at theirs. The transformation from dutiful daughter to financial saboteur happened gradually over 3 weeks, each day bringing new opportunities to use my parents' personal information in ways they could never have imagined when they carelessly shared their details with the child they considered too responsible to ever cause problems. I approached their destruction with the same methodical precision I brought to medical procedures, carefully, systematically, and with full understanding of the consequences my actions would create. The initial credit card applications had been approved so easily that I wondered why anyone struggled with debt. Online lending platforms seemed eager to extend credit to Robert and Linda Chen, offering promotional rates and high limits that suggested my parents had maintained excellent credit scores through decades of careful financial management. Those scores were about to become casualties in a war they didn't know was being fought. I started each morning by checking my email for approval notifications and credit confirmations, then spending my lunch breaks making purchases that would slowly accumulate into serious financial problems. Gas stations where I bought gift cards that could be converted to cash. Department stores where I purchased items that could be returned for store credit. Online retailers where I ordered products to be shipped to temporary addresses I had established using mail forwarding services. The key was creating realistic spending patterns that wouldn't immediately trigger fraud alerts while accumulating enough debt to seriously impact their financial stability. I studied their actual shopping habits through years of family knowledge, mimicking their preferences and purchasing patterns so that the fraudulent activity would blend seamlessly with their legitimate spending. Robert Chen apparently needed a new laptop for his accounting practice, followed by office supplies and software that any professional might reasonably purchase. Linda Chen had developed expensive tastes in clothing and jewelry that aligned with her self-image as a successful middle-class woman who deserved nice things. Each transaction required careful planning to avoid detection. I used public computers at libraries and internet cafes to avoid leaving digital trails that could be traced to my personal devices. I varied my timing and locations to prevent patterns that might suggest systematic fraud rather than legitimate spending by people with evolving financial needs. The psychological aspect was as important as the technical execution. I needed to create enough financial pressure to force my parents into genuine distress without triggering immediate investigation that might lead back to me. The goal was slow building debt that would gradually compromise their ability to maintain their lifestyle while giving them time to experience the anxiety and desperation they had falsely claimed to feel. After 2 weeks, I estimated that I had accumulated approximately $15,000 in debt across their various accounts, enough to create serious monthly payment obligations, but not enough to immediately destroy their credit or trigger criminal investigations. The amounts were large enough to cause problems, but small enough to appear within the realm of possible legitimate spending by people experiencing lifestyle inflation. But credit card debt was only the beginning of my campaign. I began researching more sophisticated financial attacks that would create longer-lasting consequences for people who valued their economic stability above their family relationships. Home equity loans offered particularly attractive opportunities for revenge. My parents' house had appreciated significantly over the years they had lived there, creating substantial equity that could be accessed through various lending products. As someone who had grown up in that house, I possessed detailed knowledge of its value, mortgage balance, and equity position. The applications required more documentation than credit cards, but I had access to enough personal information to create convincing portfolios. Copies of utility bills that established residence history, employment verification that confirmed Dad's position at his accounting firm, income documentation that supported their loan applications. Most importantly, I understood their financial psychology well enough to request amounts and terms that aligned with their actual decision-making patterns. They weren't reckless spenders. They were strategic consumers who made calculated purchases that enhanced their lifestyle and social status. The fraudulent loans I obtained reflected those preferences, amounts large enough to fund significant purchases, but not so large as to seem completely out of character. The first home equity loan for $25,000 was approved within 5 business days, deposited into an account I had opened in my father's name, at a bank where he had no previous relationship. The second loan for $18,000 followed a week later, this time using my mother's information and employment history. I withdrew the money immediately, converting it to cashier's checks that I deposited into my own accounts after allowing appropriate time for the transactions to clear. The funds would allow me to rebuild my savings while creating debt obligations that would force my parents to experience genuine financial stress for the first time in years. But the most satisfying aspect of the campaign was the anticipation. Every day brought my parents closer to discovering that their financial stability was an illusion, that their carefully maintained credit was being systematically destroyed, that their ability to fund their luxury lifestyle was disappearing, while they remained oblivious to the growing problems. They were still posting social media updates about their wonderful life, still maintaining the facades that were so important to their self-image, still operating under the assumption that their daughter was too responsible and too grateful to ever cause them serious problems. I imagined their faces when the first statements arrived, showing thousands of dollars in charges they didn't remember making. I pictured their confusion as they contacted credit card companies to dispute transactions that appeared legitimate but felt impossible. I anticipated their growing panic as they realized that someone with comprehensive access to their personal information was systematically destroying their financial foundation. Soon, they would understand what it felt like to be desperate, to face expenses they couldn't afford, to choose between necessities because resources were suddenly limited. They would experience the genuine financial emergency they had lied about having, except this time there would be no sympathetic daughter willing to sacrifice her savings to help them through their crisis. This time, their emergency would be real, and the person who had created it would be watching their panic with the same amusement they had shown when dismissing my pain as dramatic overreaction. The first signs of my parents' financial destruction appeared exactly 28 days after I had begun my campaign, arriving in the form of frantic phone calls that revealed they were finally discovering the scope of what someone had done to their carefully maintained economic stability. Mom called me at work during a particularly busy shift, her voice carrying the kind of genuine panic that she had falsely claimed to feel when asking for my $3,000. "Sarah, we need your help," she said, without preamble, her words tumbling out with the desperate speed of someone who was losing control of a situation she didn't understand. "Someone has been using our credit cards to make purchases we didn't authorize. There are thousands of dollars in charges that we never made." I stepped into a supply closet where I could speak privately, fighting to keep my voice neutral, despite the satisfaction that was building in my chest. "That sounds terrible. Have you contacted the credit card companies?" "We've been on the phone with them for hours," Mom replied, her voice thick with stress and confusion. "They're saying the charges look legitimate because they match our normal spending patterns, but we never bought these things. Someone must have our account information." Someone did have their account information. Someone who had grown up in their house, listened to their conversations, and memorized their personal details through decades of family interactions. Someone who understood their preferences well enough to make fraudulent purchases that would be difficult to dispute. "What kind of charges are you seeing?" I asked, genuinely curious about how much financial damage I had created in just 4 weeks. "Everything," Mom said, her voice breaking slightly. "Clothes, electronics, restaurant bills, gas stations all over the city. There's even a charge for some kind of online jewelry purchase that your father supposedly made last Tuesday while he was in meetings all day. The jewelry purchase had been particularly satisfying to arrange, a $800 bracelet from an online retailer that specialized in the kind of luxury accessories my mother coveted, but claimed she couldn't afford. I had used Dad's credit card information but shipped the item to an address where it would be received by someone who thought they were accepting a package for a neighbor who traveled frequently. That definitely sounds like identity theft, I said, injecting just enough sympathy into my voice to sound genuinely concerned rather than secretly pleased. Have you filed police reports? The credit card companies want us to dispute each charge individually and provide documentation proving we didn't make the purchases. Dad's voice came on the line, as he apparently grabbed the phone from Mom. But how do you prove you didn't buy something? How do you document where you were every moment of every day? The frustration in his voice was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. Identity theft victims face the burden of proving innocence rather than having their claims automatically accepted, and the process of disputing fraudulent charges was deliberately cumbersome to discourage frivolous complaints. My parents were discovering that being victims wasn't as simple as making phone calls and expecting immediate resolution. "It gets worse," Mom added, her voice dropping to a whisper as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "We found out about credit inquiries we never authorized. Someone has been applying for loans using our information. Someone had indeed been applying for loans. The home equity applications had generated hard credit inquiries that would remain on their credit reports for months, lowering their scores and making future legitimate borrowing more difficult and expensive. But those inquiries were just the visible evidence of problems that were far more serious than my parents yet realized. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, trying to sound concerned rather than curious about the scope of my own financial attack. "So far, we've identified about 20,000 in fraudulent charges," Dad said, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who was being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. "But they keep finding more as they review older statements. This has been going on for weeks. $20,000. I had been more successful than I had calculated, accumulating debt that represented several months of their combined income and would require significant time and effort to resolve, even if they could prove the charges were fraudulent. The worst part is that our credit scores have dropped," Mom continued, her voice thick with tears that sounded genuine this time. "We tried to refinance the house to get a better interest rate, but the bank said our credit wasn't good enough anymore. All these inquiries and new accounts have made us look like financial risks. Financial risks. The irony was beautiful. They were indeed financial risks, just not in the way they imagined. The real risk to their economic stability wasn't random identity thieves, but the daughter they had trained to be financially responsible and strategically minded. "Have you considered hiring a credit monitoring service?" I suggested. knowing that such services would help them identify fraudulent activity, but wouldn't prevent the damage I was continuing to inflict daily. They might be able to catch future problems faster. We've already signed up for everything we can find, Dad replied, but the damage is already done. Sarah, we hate to ask, but we might need to borrow some money to cover the minimum payments on these fraudulent accounts while we work through the dispute process. There it was, the request I had been anticipating since beginning my campaign. My parents, who had recently returned from a Caribbean vacation funded by my emergency assistance, were once again asking for financial help to address a crisis they couldn't understand or control. How much do you need? I asked, wondering if they would request another $3,000, or if their desperation had grown to match the scope of their actual problems. Maybe $5,000, Mom said quietly. Just temporarily, until we can get this mess sorted out. $5,000. More than they had asked for during their fake emergency. Requested now that they were experiencing genuine financial distress, created by the daughter they had dismissed as overly dramatic and financially naive. I'll see what I can do, I told them, having no intention of providing assistance that would reduce the pressure I was systematically applying to their economic foundation. The unraveling was proceeding exactly as I had planned, but we were still in the early stages of their financial destruction. The unraveling accelerated exponentially in week 6, when my parents discovered that their financial problems extended far beyond fraudulent credit card charges into territory that threatened their ability to maintain the middle-class lifestyle they considered fundamental to their identity. Dad called me at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, his voice carrying a level of panic that suggested he had been awake all night, trying to understand how their economic foundation had collapsed so completely. Sarah, we need to meet immediately, he said without any greeting or explanation. Something terrible is happening, and we can't figure out who's doing this to us or why. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near my apartment, neutral territory where they couldn't control the conversation or rely on the comfortable facades that usually protected them from uncomfortable truths. When I arrived, both parents looked like they had aged 5 years in the past month. Dad's normally neat appearance was disheveled, and Mom's careful makeup couldn't hide the stress lines that had appeared around her eyes. Someone has taken out loans against our house, Mom said before I had even sat down, her voice tight with fear and confusion. Home equity loans that we never applied for, never signed for, never even knew existed until we got statements in the mail. I sat down carefully, arranging my expression to show appropriate shock and concern, while internally celebrating the fact that my most sophisticated financial attacks were finally being discovered. How much money are we talking about? $43,000, Dad replied, showing me bank statements and loan documents that I recognized because I had created them. Someone used our personal information to take out loans against the equity in our house, and the money has already been withdrawn from accounts we didn't know existed. $43,000. The amount was larger than I had calculated because I had continued accumulating smaller loans and credit advances, while they were focused on disputing the more obvious credit card charges. The systematic nature of the financial attack was becoming clear to them, but they still had no idea who was orchestrating their destruction. The bank says the applications look legitimate, Mom continued, her voice breaking as she struggled to maintain composure. They have all our personal information, social security numbers, employment history, income documentation. Whoever did this knows everything about our financial situation. Someone who knew everything about their financial situation. Someone who had grown up in their house, observed their spending patterns, and listened to their conversations about money and credit, and the importance of maintaining good financial reputations. Someone they had trained to be responsible with money and strategic in her thinking. Have you contacted the police? I asked, knowing that law enforcement would struggle to investigate crimes that involved such detailed personal knowledge and sophisticated execution. We filed a report, Dad said, but the detective said these kinds of cases are difficult to solve unless the perpetrator makes obvious mistakes. Professional identity thieves know how to cover their tracks and make the fraud look legitimate. Professional identity thieves. If only they knew how amateur my operation actually was, how their destruction had been accomplished by their own daughter using information they had freely shared and trust they had carelessly granted. It gets worse, Mom said, pulling out additional documents that showed the full scope of their financial catastrophe. Our credit scores have dropped so low that we can't qualify for normal financing on anything. The car dealership turned down our application for a new lease. The department store closed our account. Even our insurance company is threatening to raise our rates because they consider us higher risk. I reviewed the credit reports they showed me, noting with satisfaction that my campaign had been even more effective than I had hoped. Their scores had dropped from the high 700s to the low 500s, transforming them from preferred customers to financial pariahs who would struggle to access credit for years. The mortgage company sent us a letter, Dad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They're concerned about the new debt obligations and want to review our loan terms. If they decide we're overextended, they could demand immediate payment or force us to refinance at much higher rates. Forced refinancing. The possibility that they might lose their house, the symbol of their middle-class success, and the foundation of their social identity, was clearly terrifying them in ways that mere credit card debt hadn't accomplished. "Sarah," Mom said, reaching across the table to grab my hand with desperate intensity. "We need help, real help. We're talking about potentially losing our home, our credit, everything we've worked for. If you could lend us enough money to hire a lawyer and a credit specialist." "How much?" I interrupted, curious to learn what they thought their salvation was worth. "Maybe 15,000, Dad said quietly. "Enough to cover the immediate debts while we work with professionals to prove these charges are fraudulent." $15,000. Nearly 5 times what they had asked for during their fake emergency, and more than 5 times what I had given them for groceries and medication that they had spent on Caribbean vacations instead. "I don't have $15,000, I said truthfully. "I gave you my savings 3 months ago, remember? For your financial emergency?" The reminder of their previous lies hit them like physical blows, and I watched them realize that their current crisis was genuine, while their previous request had been manufactured. They were finally experiencing the desperation they had falsely claimed to feel, except this time there would be no sympathetic family member willing to sacrifice her financial security to help them maintain their lifestyle. "Sarah," Mom said desperately, "surely you understand that this is different. This is a real emergency. Someone is destroying our lives and we need family support to fight back." "You're right," I agreed. "This is different. This time your emergency is real instead of fabricated. This time someone actually is threatening your financial stability instead of you lying about your circumstances to manipulate money from relatives." I stood up from the table, looking down at the parents who had spent my entire life treating me as a convenient resource rather than a valued family member. "And this time," I concluded, "the person destroying your financial lives is someone who learned from watching you manipulate and exploit family members for decades." Their faces went pale as they began to understand exactly who had created their crisis and why they deserved every moment of the financial devastation they were experiencing. The silence that followed my revelation stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, as my parents processed the information that their daughter, the responsible, financially conservative child they had dismissed and exploited for decades, had systematically destroyed their economic stability, using the personal information they had carelessly shared and the strategic thinking they had trained her to develop. "You," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at me with an expression of shock so profound that she seemed unable to process what she was hearing. "You did this to us?" "I did exactly what you taught me to do," I replied calmly, settling back into my chair, now that the truth was finally in the open. "I identified people with resources I needed, developed strategic approaches to accessing those resources, and executed plans that served my interests without considering the impact on anyone else." Dad's face had gone completely white, his hands shaking as he looked through the loan documents and credit reports with new understanding. "Sarah, you've destroyed us. Our credit, our house, our financial reputation, everything we've built over 30 years. Everything you built using money you manipulated from family members," I corrected, "including the $3,000 you stole from me to fund your vacation while claiming you couldn't afford groceries." "We didn't steal," Mom began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "You lied about being in financial distress to convince me to give you my life savings, then immediately used that money to pay for a luxury trip that you didn't invite me to participate in. When I confronted you about the deception, you laughed at my pain and told me I was being dramatic. I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of their social media posts from the Caribbean vacation, images that had triggered the campaign of financial destruction they were now experiencing. You taught me that family relationships are transactional, that love can be measured in financial contributions, and that lying is acceptable when it serves your interests. I learned those lessons very well. The weight of their own behavior was clearly crushing them as they began to understand how their treatment of me had created someone capable of their systematic destruction. But I wasn't finished revealing the scope of what their casual cruelty had cost them. "The identity theft was just the beginning," I continued, watching their faces as I described the full extent of their problems. "I also used your information to apply for payday loans, rent-to-own agreements, and other forms of predatory lending that will continue generating financial obligations for months. Sarah, please, Dad said desperately. We can fix this. We can change how we treat you. We can include you in family activities. You can't fix 30 years of systematic favoritism and exploitation with promises made during a crisis you can't solve, I interrupted. You can't repair relationships by offering changes only after you need help from the person you've been mistreating. I stood up again, looking down at the parents who had finally learned what it felt like to be desperate, afraid, and dependent on someone who held all the power in their relationship. But here's what I find most interesting about this conversation, I said, pulling out one final document that I had been saving for this moment. You're so focused on the financial crimes I committed against you that you haven't asked about the money. What money? Mom asked weakly. The $43,000 I borrowed against your house using your identities. The money that's sitting in my savings account earning interest while you struggle to understand how someone could be so cruel to family members. Their expressions shifted from shock to horror as they realized that their financial destruction had directly funded my financial recovery, that their daughter had not only destroyed their economic stability, but had profited from their suffering. That money belongs to us, Dad said, his voice gaining strength as he focused on the one aspect of the situation that might be recoverable. You can't keep money you obtained through fraud. Actually, I can, I replied, showing them the bank statements that proved my successful conversion of their equity into my savings, because I'm going to use that money to hire the same kind of lawyers and credit specialists you need, except I'll be using them to protect myself from prosecution rather than to repair damaged credit. You planned this, Mom said, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. You planned to destroy us from the beginning. I planned to hold you accountable for treating me like a resource instead of a person, I corrected. I planned to create consequences for lying, manipulation, and casual cruelty. I planned to make you understand what it feels like to be financially desperate instead of just pretending to be desperate when you wanted money. I gathered my purse and stood to leave, looking down at the parents who had spent my entire life teaching me that family meant exploitation and love meant sacrifice without reciprocation. You have a choice now, I told them, as they sat surrounded by the evidence of their financial destruction. You can continue trying to maintain the facades that are so important to your self-image, or you can learn to live with the consequences of treating family members as disposable resources. Sarah, we're your parents, Mom said desperately. You can't just destroy us and walk away. You're the people who taught me that relationships are transactional and that family members exist to serve each other's interests, I replied. I learned those lessons perfectly, and now you're experiencing what it's like to be on the receiving end of the dynamic you created. As I walked away from the coffee shop, leaving them to contemplate the wreckage of their financial lives and their relationships with the daughter they had systematically undervalued, I felt something I had never experienced before. The satisfaction of being treated with the fear and respect that comes from holding real power over people who had previously considered me powerless. They had laughed at my pain when they thought I was helpless. Now they would spend years rebuilding their financial lives while understanding that their daughter had become someone capable of destroying them completely whenever she chose to do so. The overlooked child had finally found her voice, and it was much louder than their laughter had ever been.